Good morning. It's great to join with you this morning as we gather around God's Word and we continue on the Lenten journey towards Holy Week, towards Easter, the cross, and also the resurrection. And that is very much the focus of this passage in John's Gospel, our Gospel reading for today. And it's a reading that is challenging and confronting, and it certainly was for me when I began preparing this message, as I'll talk about in a little while. But it's a reading that has, as is often the case with John, so many layers, and it's something that you absolutely have to continue to keep digging and looking again in order to find what it is that God is speaking through his word and through this situation. So we enter the situation. It's one of high tension. Jesus is being sought by many people for good or for ill. He seems to be he's not available. He's in hiding, or he's hidden from view, and he's very much aware that there's an element of timing involved, that when the time is right, then things will move forward, and what needs to happen will happen, and he is very, very aware of what is his purpose is, what his everything in his life is all very focused, and we find a very focused Jesus in this passage in John's Gospel. And the disciples are very aware of all this because Jesus has been talking about it to them for a long time, and they get it. What they think is that Jesus is going to lead a revolution, that as Messiah he will bring about freedom for the captives, and the Jewish people will no longer be under the tyranny of the Roman oppressors. That's what they think is going on, and we see them speaking in those terms over and over again. But Jesus is speaking in a completely different way, and about a completely different reality, and we see it again in these passages. So this is where we enter into this scene, and we enter in verse 21 with foreigners or Greek men who have come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Clearly they have heard of Jesus, and they are wanting, well, I don't know exactly what they want, other than they pose the question to Philip, we want to meet Jesus, which seems like a straightforward enough request. And yet it's a question that isn't directly answered within the passage, which at first caused me to wonder and to get frustrated. Why would you include this detail if it has no bearing on the rest of the story? And Jesus' response is just like so beyond, like it's so extreme, and it seemed quite harsh to me. It got me thinking about, well, I wonder what these Greek men were really after. When they asked to meet Jesus, what were they seeking? What kind of person were they expecting to meet? And then the deeper question bubbled up as I thought and reflected on it. I wonder what kind of Jesus I think I'd like to meet, or if I was to have an encounter with Jesus, what kind of Jesus or person is that going to be, or would I like it to be? And then that is the question, I guess, for all of us as we enter this text, and the question is asked, we want to meet Jesus. I wonder, who is the Jesus that you want to meet? Because we should be careful what we wish for. It doesn't always work out the way we expect. So I want to take you on a journey, the journey of preparing this message, the journey of interacting with this particular text, and the journey that Jesus invites us to take with him. And I hope that in sharing this, a reflection on this process, that it encourages you and helps you, because that to me is important, and it's what I believe is part of being a chaplain and being a believer is that, and a follower of Jesus, is that we are able to encourage one another. So the journey of this message. When I very first read the readings for this week, a number of weeks and weeks ago, the passage straight away speaks tension, and it's confronting. It didn't seem at all encouraging, and in fact it seemed quite harsh and judgmental. And my initial response is very telling, and it's not. I'm not all that proud to admit it to you, but as I read the words, "Unless a grain of wheat is planted in the soil and dies, it remains alone," I thought, no, this is too difficult. This is a message that I do not want to read. I don't want to interact with it. I don't want to give a message that is in this tone. I don't want to be confronted, and I don't want to be giving a confronting message. And surely there's an easier passage. Surely I could choose one of the other lectionary texts for today. And yet I sense that this was the one that I couldn't really get away from. Focusing on and engaging with this particular text, it seemed to be the right time to speak on this particular topic, the topic of life and death. And so I looked again, and it's always worth looking again. And the first way that I looked again was I turned to the community, to the people of God who I'm connected with in this place and in this space. Specifically, I spoke to and sat down with Vladimir and Karen, and together we meditated upon, we talked through, we explored, and I expressed my misgivings about what was in front of me to do and what I committed to doing, and in the sharing and the talking, and light was shed and layers were revealed and deeper truths emerged, and grace emerged. I was also encouraged and began to read more widely those people that are experts on the Bible and and have a particular sense of what the text means and what Jesus is calling us to in this, and to give some context to it from the historical perspective, but also from a social perspective. And so I looked again, and grace emerged, and God was speaking, and it was encouraging, and it meant that I got a deeper sense of what was being spoken in this passage. So I continued to look, and it's always worth looking again, always. And I started to look around and see that life and death and resurrection were all around. In the natural world, creation speaks the glory of God in so many ways. I recently went to visit a labyrinth, and we were led to walk in a reflective fashion through the labyrinth to the centre. And as I did that, what I really noticed was that life and death were indeed all around. As we walked, there was mud because it had been raining, and it was squelchy and messy, and yet we were surrounded by this amazing cacophony of green. Just, it was thunderous, the life that surrounded us, and yet we walked upon the ground that was clearly in various stages of decomposition, all the leaf matter, and it was glorious, it was joyous, and it spoke of life and death and resurrection right there in the natural world. And so I looked, and I looked again, and grace emerged, and God was speaking. It's always worth looking again. So then I looked at where I work in the hospital, and with the families and with the staff, and their death and life are very present. It is unavoidable working in a hospital. We are often confronted by death, and families within the hospital are in various stages of how they deal with death. There's resistance to, sometimes very strong resistance to death, complete denial in fact, and then other times there's a sense of acceptance and even of welcoming death. And it's such a privilege to be in that space and walking alongside families as they come to terms with where they are and the timing of life and death, and the mysteriousness of that, and the vulnerability that we come to be in of such a vulnerable place in the midst of those in the midst of feeling out of control and feeling that what you most want you aren't able to make happen. So there's such it's so confronting, and yet there's such a preciousness and value to life within the hospital. And then I looked again, because it's always worth looking again, and grace present in my own life, God speaking in the circumstances of my life, and life, death and resurrection present in the way that I have come to be able to speak with you this morning. We were connected into one church, very much feeling that was our home, that we would always be there. And then one ordinary Monday morning, a seemingly random accident takes place where my husband is injured, and we move in a different direction from that moment. And part of that was that the connection to the church fell away, and we found ourselves in a completely different space, seemingly surrounded by the death of all that we thought was important and vital and life-giving. And yet what has come from that is so much newness of life, new communities and new opportunities to serve, and new ways of being, and just resurrection everywhere in my own life. And I would encourage you to consider these themes for your life, and where there's been a sense of death and of loss, but what possibly has emerged from that, and to see whether or not the pattern that we see that Jesus is referring to and is pointing to us is present in your life. Because Jesus is calling us to live and die and to be born again in newness of life, in a new way of living. That he's calling us to choose to give up our life. And he shows us this in his whole life, and he shows it specifically in this passage. He says that it's not what he would want, but what the Father would want. That he is giving him his own life over and taking on the life that the Father is offering. So the life that we hold on to, that we think is so precious and so permanent and so known and so safe, if we can step out of the known into the mysterious way that Jesus shows us, though it will be costly, what we gain is so much richer and fuller and deeper and ultimately truer. That true life that is found only in Christ. In this passage, and through his whole life, Jesus says to us, "Follow me, because my servants must be where I am." It's about being. Doing might flow from that, but being first. Now, I came to this passage and I was looking to meet Jesus. I thought that I didn't really understand, and I got frustrated, and I turned away because I didn't like what I was hearing, because I was actually looking for a nice, comforting or inspiring Jesus. And then I looked, and I looked again, and I looked again, and I came to see that Jesus was calling me to walk with him, to be with him where he is, even if that place is challenging and confronting. And yet when we're with Jesus, then it's not so challenging and not so confronting, but actually a place of grace. So I don't know in this passage whether the Greek men visiting Jerusalem, whether they found Jesus, and they were seeking to meet him in a physical meeting. And yet Jesus is present to us now beyond what we can see and know in the physical. And yet he's also present in what we can see, and what we in this present space with the people that are around us. We can be present with Jesus, both, beyond understanding, and yet it is somehow true. So God is speaking. The word is eternally present, and glory is all about us, thundering about us, if we have ears to hear and eyes to see. In this passage, the voice of God thundered out, "I have already brought glory to my name, and I will do so again." God's glory is all about us, from start to finish, from life to death, and from death to life, and every moment in between. And God's glory is for our benefit. It's astounding. It's miraculous. And it's shown in the person of Jesus. He shows God's glory in his life, in his death, and even death on a cross. And then he shows God's glory in that he is raised once again to life, newness of life in the Spirit. Sometimes God's voice is loud, thunderous, and sometimes incomprehensible in its in how intense it can be. But also God's voice can come in other ways. We know the story of Elisha and how he sought to be with God and to hear from God, and God's was not in the great strong wind, and he was not in the earthquake that shook the ground, and he wasn't in the fire, but he was in the gentle whisper. So sometimes the way that we can hear God speaking is to slow down, to quieten ourselves, and to really listen, to take that time so that God can be heard in amongst all the other noises and all the other voices that seek to speak to us. And I know that for myself, that's one of the ways that I'm able to hear God speaking to me, is in the quiet. Regardless, keep looking, keep seeking, keep knocking. Look again. It's always worth looking again. Jesus is present. God is speaking. God's Spirit is drawing all people into the mystery and the glory that is already all around us, in life and in death and in life again. So it's great to share with you this morning, and I hope that that as you continue into the Lenten, along the Lenten path, that you know that Jesus is present with you, and that he is calling you into a deeper and deeper relationship with him.